But this was a great kind of a wrap on the Jew hunt and what this was like. Back to the book. The Jew hunt was not a brief episode. It was a tenacious, remorseless, ongoing campaign in which the hunters tracked down and killed their prey in direct and personal confrontation. It was not a passing phase, but an existential condition of constant readiness and intention to kill every last Jew who could be found. Now we're going to cover this last massacre that took place, and Jews had been sent from to a prison camp to be executed, and they were rounded up. I think it was a place called Labick, and they were sent to be executed. And the police battalion is now acting as kind of guards and accessories to this, to make sure that the executions, these mass executions, take place correctly. Going back to the book, as the Jews passed between the chain of reserve policemen into the camp, music blared from 2 loudspeaker trucks. Despite the attempt to drown out other noise, the sound of steady gunfire could be heard from the camp. The Jews were taken to the last row of barracks, where they undressed. Arms raised, hands clasped behind their necks, totally naked, they were led in groups from the barracks through a hole cut in the fence to the trenches that had been dug behind the camp. This route was guarded by men from the Reserve Police Battalion 101. Stationed only 10 meters from the graves, Heinrich Bockholt of 1st Company witnessed the killing procedure. Quote, "From my position, I could now observe how the Jews were driven naked from the barracks by other members of our battalion. The shooters of the execution commandos, who sat on the edge of the graves directly in front of me, were members of the SD." And the SD is like the SS intelligence group, the SD. Some distance behind each shooter stood several other SD men who constantly kept the magazines of the submachine guns filled and handed them to each shooter. A number of shooters were assigned to each grave. Today I can no longer provide details about the number of graves. It is possible that there were many such graves where shooting took place simultaneously. I definitely remember that the naked Jews were driven directly into the graves and forced to lie down quite precisely on top of those who had been shot before them. The shooter then fired off a burst at these prone victims. How long the action lasted, I can no longer say with certainty. Presumably, it lasted the entire day, because I remember that I was relieved once from my post. I can give no details about the number of victims, but there were an awful lot of them. It's almost incomprehensible to imagine that you're one of these Jews getting forced, you're naked, lay down, go into this pit, lay down on top of those other people that were just shot so you can be shot too. Another witness, Martin Detmold, quote, "Because I was a group leader and could move about more freely, I went once directly to the execution site and saw how the newly arriving Jews had to lie down on those already shot. They were then likewise shot with bursts from submachine guns. The SD men took care that the Jews were shot in such a way that there were inclines in the piles of corpses, enabling the newcomers to lie down on the corpses piled as much as 3 meters high. The whole business was the most gruesome I have ever seen in my life, because I was frequently able to see that after a burst had been fired, the Jews were only wounded, and those still living were more or less buried alive beneath the corpses of those shot later, without the wounded being given so-called mercy shots. I remember that from out of the pile of corpses, the SS men were cursed by the wounded." And that was sort of the final participation of 101 Battalion